today I am running our LPG line from the back of the van to the front. You can see where I've done some bends in the copper tubing in order to not use a bunch of fittings, which could potentially be points for leaks, and also reduce cost. A good tube bender and some practice, and you can make some really nice turns. What I'm doing now, this is where the cooktop is going to be, and I intentionally cut my tubing a little bit long because I knew that I was going to need to cut it down and wanted to have a little bit of excess. This is a Summit to cooktop from Italy, so there's a conversion to pipe thread and then to pipe thread to flare. The reason why I'm using flares is that they're very vibration resistant. And you can see flare fittings here with this angle on the flare, and basically you can't use without an adapter. You cannot use flare with NPT and vice versa. You've got to convert. NPT threads are using the threads to seal, whereas the flare is not using the threads, it's using the sealing surface. So with flares, you don't use pipe sealant or thread or Teflon tape, but you do need to make a nice flare surface, and this is where these flare kits come into play. So I'll show you that, but first I got to cut the pipe to the right length. Again, there's lots of videos out there on how to do this, and I highly recommend that you practice. The last thing you want is to have a insecure joint that leaks gas in your van. One thing that I did find out going through all of this is there are so many different types of fittings, and one that you don't want to use with gas are your typical compression fittings that you use with water. Those might hold water, but they're not really set up to handle gas, and they're not very vibration resistant. So make sure you're using the right type of fittings for gas if you're going to use gas. All right, so I've used the tubing cutter to cut the end off of the copper to get to the right length. So now that I can make a flare, you basically just tighten this and then spin it around the copper tubing, and you keep slowly tightening it. You don't want to crush the tubing. Keep slowly tightening it until it cuts all the way through. You see the little disc here that cuts the tubing. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to use this flare kit now to make a flare on the end of the tubing. And this was a practice one I did, which was a little bit not flared enough. What you want to do is you want to get about 3/4 of the flare to the cone of what you're mating to. So as you can see, this one, it's maybe 1/3 or so, and it's not a very uniform flare, so this isn't a really good one. It says to use about 1/8 of an inch coming out of the end of this. I actually need to go a little bit more to get a big enough flare. This is the flare nut, and one thing for sure is before you flare, make sure you put your flare nut on. Otherwise, you're not going to get this thing on later, and you're going to be highly frustrated when you have to redo all your tubing. So once we make a flare, then this will then pull this on to this mating surface. I am going to now set up the flare kit. This is the part that the tubing goes through. Then once you have that tight, then you use this now to make the flare portion. Basically is tightening into the tubing. All right, so I've tightened the tool. Next, I'm now going to make the flare. Note, make sure you got the nut on. And sometimes it might be better to do this before you get this thing all installed. I put these bends in. Now I can't move this back any further. I can bend it down just a little bit and get in here. I wasn't 100% sure on my length though, which is why I waited. So here's another angle, so you can see the flare now has been made. I'll take this off, and we will make sure the nut will pass over the flare and that the flare is large enough. One thing that you have to be careful is if you make the flare too big, then the nut can't go around the flare. And I can move the nut. Basically, it should be just about perfect. So before you go to operate your new gas stove in your van, make sure you know if it's set up for propane or not. So the Summit came with a propane conversion kit, but it's really set up for natural gas at this point. And there's a big difference in terms of flow rate on propane versus natural gas. So you really want to make sure, if you don't want to have flames shooting to the ceiling, that you got the right nozzle in. So you can take the grate off, and for each of these burners, see this nozzle here on both sides. It's a European stove. Needs a 7mm to be able to remove. Okay, loose. And then I'm just going to screw in the other nozzle. Just want to show the difference in the nozzle diameter. The left is propane, the right is natural gas, and that's due to the pressure in the line. Propane is a higher pressure, so it's a smaller diameter nozzle orifice opening, and that allows less gas to come out. So again, if you were to use the right nozzle, you're going to have some high flames. If you weren't prepared for that, make sure you checked that you have the right nozzle in before operating your stove. All right, so nozzles are in, gas is on. The sweet sound of success. One thing I did learn is that the diameter is slightly different from this burner to this burner. Kind of makes sense given that one is smaller than the other one. Make sure that the larger orifice diameter is on this one and the smaller one is on this one. Otherwise they won't operate correctly.